the difference in feeding 60 DMD silage and 70 or 75 DMD silage, or the difference in maybe a weanling going under the shade and doing absolutely nothing, maybe actually losing weight if it was only been fed that silage, or the difference in an animal gaining 0.5 to 0.6 kilos a day. Like, quality of silage is everything.
Hello and welcome to the Beef Edge, the Teagasc Beef Podcast, for all your latest news, information and advice for Irish beef farmers. I'm Catherine Egan, and in this second part of a 3-part podcast series, Getting Winter Ready, James Strain, nutritionist with the Inishowen Co-op, is on this week's Beef Edge podcast to discuss winter nutrition. James, you're very welcome. We're coming back again to housing year on year. There are a number of factors that farmers need to consider to maximise performance over the winter period.
Farmers are starting to house cattle now and getting them in and getting them settled, maybe getting them in dry weather and housing dry weather and settled is a good start to any winter. But I suppose we need to be looking before we even look at the nutrition side of it, is look at parasites. Cattle need to be dosed when they go in, and what do they need to be dosed for? I suppose you have internal and external parasites. So depending on how the dosing program went through the summer, there's probably bound to be a bit of a worm burden there, and maybe a bit of fluke, and obviously lice as well. So that's one of the first things that needs to be looked at. I suppose dung sampling now, we're pushing hard with enthalment and authentic resistance and stuff like that, to maybe not just dose for the sake of dosing, to check and see do the stock need dose. So maybe starting off with a dung sample or something like that, and the beef welfare scheme, I suppose, is picking that topic or picking that action would have been a good thing, and maybe just taking the sample into your local vet and seeing where you go from there first of all, and dosing accordingly to that. Like, and it's good to know there is a bit of resistance on farms, so knowing what works on your own farm, and I suppose moving between different products and different classes of wormers is obviously a good thing. That the pour-on wormer works quite well at housing, because it'll cover your stomach worms, lungworms, and sucking and biting lice. So very good product to use at that point. And I suppose it can be clipping cattle as well. At housing, it just reduces the lice burden. So I suppose that's a good thing to be looking at before you even think about the nutrition side at all.
And I suppose, James, really the first step when it comes to the nutrition side, you're looking at really formulating the diet for the animal. You're looking at what the silage quality is, and if the silage quality is unknown, it's really just guessing what type of concentrates and how much to feed. You mentioned there, as part of the beef welfare scheme, a lot of farmers might have picked the option for doing the fecal sample, and then other farmers would have picked the option for doing a silage test. Farmers not in the scheme, how can farmers go about getting their silage sample tested?
Well, I know ourselves here, anybody that's buying meal of us, we would do a free silage sample for all our farmers that are buying feed. And I would say most mills would do something similar, or take your silage sample to Teagasc, or you can go to any lab and send it to any lab yourself independently. But I suppose we're harping on about it for years, but it is vitally important to get your silage tested, because it is the main part of most diets, unless you're on an ad lib meal finishing system, especially somebody feeding weanlings. It's vitally important to know what's in your silage. And when you don't know, obviously whatever's in the bale or what's in the pit at this stage is there. You have to work with it, but trying to improve quality of silage is something for next year. But knowing what you have as the building block to try and make up any ration, or knowing what to feed along with the silage to try and gain maximum production. So getting your silage tested you couldn't emphasize enough how important that is.
And then, James, when the report comes back, like for farmers that have tested their silage sample, the report has come back, how did they go about analysing that report? Like, what are the key things they should be looking for when the report comes back on the silage sample?
Well, I suppose that the thing that all farmers tend to latch onto is the DMD, and that's, I suppose, is definitely the first thing that most people will look at. And ideally, I suppose you want it above 70 if possible, or even higher. But I suppose with most of the farmers that we would be dealing up here would be suckler sheep farmers, and I suppose it's not that easy for them to be cutting silage in early May. But if they could try and cut silage at the end of May, you'd be still hoping to get to get your DMD above 70. So like that'd be the first thing to look at. I suppose dry matter as well. Like you can have silage at 80 DMD, but if it's 18% dry matter, it's far from ideal. So we'd like a reasonably high dry matter, obviously above 20, but closer to 30 if possible. At the end of the day, I suppose that the lower the dry matter, as the less water an animal's taken in with every mouthful that it's eaten. So you're kind of hoping you'll get better intakes with lower dry matter silage. Now, obviously, if you're working with a pit, very low dry matter silage can cause other problems with heating and things like that, and it's not easy to ensile. But a happy medium there, somewhere between 25 and well, I suppose depending on the year, even 23 to 28. If you could aim for somewhere around then for most farmers that we'd be dealing with, suckler and sheep, you'd be happy enough. A DMD of ideally above 70. And I suppose a pH, somewhere between 3.8 and 4.2. Those would be some of the main factors there, and a protein as well. Like a protein can vary widely, depending on how much nitrogen is left on it and one thing and another. But I suppose, look, ideally maybe in around 13% protein, if possible. For a dry stock farmer, you'd be reasonably happy with that, I suppose.
And when you look at putting rations together now, James, for weanlings, what impact can the silage quality have on the weanling performance?
It's everything, Catherine. I suppose, the difference in feeding 60 DMD silage and 70 or 75 DMD silage, sure, it's the difference in maybe a weanling going into the shade and doing absolutely nothing, maybe actually losing weight if it was only been fed that silage, or the difference in an animal gaining half to 0.6 kilos a day. Like, quality of silage is everything. I suppose if you have really good silage, you might get away without feeding meal at all. I do like, and it's not just because I'm selling it, but a couple of kilos of meal to win into the winter. I think it's money well spent, no matter how good your silage is. It just adds that little bit more to the ration, and you probably get a little bit more intake because of feeding that bit of meal. But there's a huge difference. Like, definitely, there's plenty of weanlings around the country go into the shade they come out of the shade the same weight they went in, and maybe in some cases even later.
And when it comes to the rations, James, what do farmers need to look for, when they're looking at the label?
Well, I suppose that's a very good point, Catherine, and it's something we would be hammering home all the time is to look at what ingredients is in the rations. Like, we would use a small amount of ingredients. We're looking at things like the first ingredient in your label will be what's the highest percentage in the ration. So I suppose your first ingredient, you wanted something like maize or barley or something like that, a good high quality cereal type ingredient. Then you're looking at your protein. So where's your protein coming from? Ideally, in a weanling ration, I suppose you'd like most of it be coming from soya because of the high bypass factor. That the animal can just use much more of that protein. Crude protein is called crude for a reason. It's exactly that. It's a crude figure of how much protein's in a particular ingredient, but it doesn't take into consideration how much of that protein the animal can actually use. So you're looking for most of your protein to come from soya, I suppose, and then secondary to that, I suppose, things like maize distillers, corn gluten, and things like that. And you're trying, I suppose, to stay away. There's three ingredients that we don't use them at all, but three ingredients that I just don't like to see on the label, and I suppose that's palm kernel, wheat feed, and sunflower meal. So we would kind of class those as fillers. So you're looking at things like your maize, your barley, your wheat, those type of ingredients for your energies and your energies and your starches, and then your proteins coming from things like soybean meal, maize distillers, corn gluten, things like that, and then I suppose a bit of fibre in the form of beet pulp or soya hulls or something like that. Not too many ingredients in a ration if possible. 4 to 6, 4 to 7 ingredients in total. Like, whenever you see a massive big long label and a heap of different things in it, not ideal in my opinion anyway. So 5 to 6 good quality ingredients, and you generally shouldn't go too far wrong from there.
And in relation to putting a ration together for finishing cattle, what should farmers be looking for from that point of view for farmers putting in cattle now at the minute to finish over the winter period?
Again, I suppose protein's not as important there. Like I suppose if we have a ration that's 12-13% protein, we'd probably be happy enough with that. Lots of the finishing rations we would have would have 4 or 5 ingredients. You're again similar type of ingredients, but maybe no need for soya. That some people would disagree with that. Some people like a bit of soya in a finishing ration, but we would usually use things like maize, barley, maize distillers, soya hulls, and beet pulp. A lot of our finishing rations would be made up with things like that. So you're looking at good level of energy, a high UFL, high UFE, 0.94, 0.95 is fed. Good starch level, 35, maybe heading for 40% starch. I suppose something to mention with the finishing animal is just be careful with the acidosis side of things. If you're going up onto high levels, it's very important to do everything slowly, build it up slowly, have at least a buffer in your ration of some description, a rumen buffer. I know if you want to push that one step further, you can go up onto yeast and things like that, but a good rumen buffer, 42% maize, I suppose, will be within sort of our rations. Barley, your next ingredient, distillers, soya hulls for your fiber source, and good quality silage, and that fed along with good quality silage, and introduced, I suppose when you're bringing cattle enough grass, it's important to bring them in, try and get them transitioned onto the silage first before you start building up meal too much. So, try and have them in. I know if you're housing cattle, maybe finishing cattle can be housed earlier, maybe you're housing them back in September. And this year, especially with good weather, it can be, you maybe don't want to take cattle in, you're happy enough for them out, but I suppose it's no harm to have finishing cattle in a week or two earlier than you think maybe you do need. Get them transitioned onto their silage. It's a big change in diet going from a grass based diet onto a silage based diet. So no harm to get them transitioned over in that period. Get the dosing out of the way, get the clipping out of the way, let them settle down, and then start building your meal up from there. So depending on what type of animal you're feeding, I suppose, like if you're maybe finishing young bulls, you could be up with ad lib feed. But no matter what the type of animal is, no sudden movements. Do everything nice and gradually and slowly. Keep an eye on dungs. You like nice solid dungs, not too hard. But if an animal starts scouring, especially when you're increasing meal levels, that an indication there's a bit of a problem and you've gone too high too quick. But just do everything nice and slow and gradual, and generally it can pay dividend in the end.
For farmers that's putting in suckler cows at the minute, their thoughts are coming to the mineral inclusion rate pre-calving in the next couple of weeks. What's important when it comes to a pre-calving mineral?
Well, I suppose things like copper, iodine, selenium, those kind of things are important with suckler cows. But then I suppose every farm can vary too. You can have different mineral deficiencies from farm to farm. So any farmer that has been having issues, I suppose, from a mineral point of view, especially in breeding stock, like maybe a discussion with the vet and maybe a blood sample from some of the cows would be no harm, just to know exactly what is needed. But like most good pre-calving minerals will have a good rate of copper, iodine, cobalt, selenium, those zinc, those kind of things. No calcium, obviously, or a very low level of calcium. You don't want to be causing problems with milk fever, feeding calcium before calving, but that probably would cover it reasonably well. Bolusing then, I suppose, is another option. If you have any farmer that feeding a good pre-calving mineral on top of the silage, definitely a very important thing to do. But any farmer that maybe has other issues from the main, the main minerals, bolusing can work quite well there. We have a slow release of minerals over sort of maybe a hopefully up as far as a 6 month period. So some of those boluses given maybe 2 months before calving will get you through the calving period and give you enough of time to get the cow back in calve again. And I suppose, speaking from experience from having issues before my own farm with suckler cows, I found they would have worked, bolusing would have worked quite well. But again, it's information is key here. So sometimes if you don't have mineral deficiency in your obviously it's important to feed a pre-calving mineral no matter what. But like if you don't have you don't have a deficiency on top of that, bolusing is an expense that you don't really need. So information, a few blood samples, get them tested and see what comes back. I know that can vary, results can vary as well, but it's not a bad thing to do.
That's great, James. And there's a number of events taking place in the marts in Donegal in the next couple of weeks.
That's right, Catherine. Yeah, there's 3 events coming up on Wednesday the 22nd in Donegal Town. Wednesday the 29th in Inishowen Co-op Mart, that's our own mart in Cairndonagh, and on Tuesday the 4th of November in Mulford Mart. So these events are in conjunction with Teagasc and the marts themselves, and the one on Inishowen Mart is in conjunction with Inishowen Co-op as well.
That's great, James. Thanks very much. There's further details on the Teagasc website in relation to a number of Getting Winter Ready events that's taking place across the country, and the Suckler Beef Mart events taking place in Donegal.
Thanks, Catherine.
That's all for this week's episode, and my thanks to James for joining me on the show. You can catch up on all other shows and interviews from the Beef Edge podcast on the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie, or you can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe so you never miss a show. For all other updates from our beef programme, keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook pages. Until next time, I'm Catherine Egan, and thanks for listening.